The alarm cut through the station before I even opened my eyes. I was still strapping my boots when the floor shook under a docking impact that nobody had approved. Red light bled through the narrow window of my quarters, painting the metal walls the color of a warning nobody wanted to read twice. I grabbed my jacket and stepped into the corridor, where aliens twice my height were already running in every direction, shouting in languages my translator struggled to keep up with. A massive shape was locking onto the outer ring of the station. Not a coalition vessel, not anything in the registry. The shape was long, dark, and quiet, in a way that made every creature near me go still for half a second, before the panic returned even louder. That was the moment the galaxy stopped pretending humans were harmless. But to understand how we got to that morning, I have to go back 3 weeks, to the day I arrived on this station as nobody, not a soldier, not a diplomat, just a name on a clipboard, trainee, lowest rank, human delegation, assigned to non-critical duties only. My name is Daniel Hart, and when I stepped off the transport ship onto Station Vexor, I was carrying one bag, one uniform 2 sizes too large, and absolutely no intention of correcting anyone who underestimated me. Station Vexor floated at the edge of contested space, a meeting point for a dozen species who had formed an uneasy coalition against threats none of them wanted to face alone. Humanity had been invited to join that coalition only a few months earlier, after our first contact with the wider galaxy. Most species treated us the way you might treat a new neighbor's small dog. Something to smile at, something to pat on the head, something that could not possibly matter in a fight. I walked through the boarding tube with my bag over one shoulder, trying to look as unremarkable as possible, which was not difficult, since most of the beings around me were already ignoring me completely. Tall reptilian officers strode past without a glance. A pair of insectoid engineers argued loudly about cargo manifests. Nobody stopped to ask who the small, soft-skinned creature in the oversized uniform might be. That suited me fine. I found my assigned bunk in the lower section of the station, a cramped space shared with 2 other junior staff from allied worlds. Before I even finished unpacking, a voice came over the station intercom, sharp and amused, announcing that the human delegation trainee was to report to the command deck for orientation. I made my way up through narrow lifts and wide observation halls, past windows that looked out onto a starfield streaked with the colors of a nearby nebula. The command deck was a circular room with a high ceiling, built to impress visiting dignitaries, and at its center stood the one figure who controlled most of what happened on this station. Her name was Vera, and she was the daughter of a ruling house from one of the founding species of the coalition, a tall predator-born woman, with sharp violet eyes, and skin that shimmered faintly under the deck lights. She was, by any measure, beautiful, intelligent, and used to being obeyed. She was also, from the very first second, unimpressed with me. I stood at attention the way my training had taught me, hands at my sides, eyes forward, while she circled me slowly, the way someone might examine a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. "You are the human," she said, not really asking. "Daniel Hart, trainee," I answered, "assigned to the delegation under Article 9 of the Coalition Agreement." She tilted her head, studying my soft hands, my lack of visible claws, my plain uniform without a single rank insignia that meant anything in this room. "A trainee," she repeated, letting the word stretch out as if she found it delicious. Her retinue, a handful of junior officers from her homeworld, laughed quietly behind her. "Your species sends its weakest member to a coalition outpost on the edge of contested space. That is either very brave or very foolish." I kept my voice level. "We go where we are needed. You will be needed for very little here," she said, turning away from me already, as if I had stopped being interesting the moment I answered without flinching. "You have no claws, no natural armor, no proper teeth. I am told your species cannot even see well in low light. What use could you possibly be to anyone?" I did not answer that one. I had learned, long before I ever left Earth, that some questions are better left unanswered in the moment, because the truth would only sound like a boast, and boasts rarely survive contact with reality. So I said nothing, and the silence made her laugh again, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the high ceiling. She assigned me, that very first day, to cargo inspection duty, the kind of work given to staff nobody expected to advance. I accepted the assignment without complaint, and spent the next several days quietly learning the layout of the station, the rhythms of its patrols, the personalities of the crew, who actually kept the place running. While Vera held court on the command deck, charming visiting officials and mocking anyone she considered beneath her, I worked in the lower decks, listening more than I spoke. It was there, among the cargo handlers and maintenance crews, that I first heard the word that made even the bravest officers on the station lower their voices. Drevuk. I asked one of the cargo handlers, a quiet four-armed being named Taurus, what the word meant, and he looked at me the way you might look at someone who had just asked what fire felt like. "You do not know the Drevuk," he said. It was not really a question. I shook my head. "They are hunters," he said. "Not soldiers, not raiders. Hunters. They do not conquer territory. They do not demand tribute. They choose prey, and then that prey disappears. Whole patrol ships, outposts, even small fleets, gone, with barely a trace left behind. No coalition species has ever driven them off when they decide to hunt." I asked him how anyone survived an encounter with them. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Nobody survives an encounter with them," he said. "They survive by never being chosen." That conversation stayed with me for the rest of the day, turning quietly in the back of my mind while I went about my duties. I had read about predator species before, back during my training, species whose entire culture and instinct revolved around reading threat the way other beings read written language. To them, weakness was a scent, a posture, a heartbeat rhythm they could detect from a distance most species could not imagine. They did not fight things that fought back in unpredictable ways. They hunted things that behaved exactly as expected. I filed that thought away and kept working, kept watching, kept letting Vera and her court believe exactly what they wanted to believe about the soft, harmless human trainee who jumped slightly too fast whenever a heavy door slammed somewhere on the station, who sat quietly during meetings and never offered an opinion unless directly asked, who carried his tray to the farthest corner of the dining hall and ate alone. It was a performance, and I was good at it, because I understood something that none of them did yet. My species had spent its entire history training for exactly this. Not for glory, not for conquest. For survival against threats that did not care how clever or organized we were. Threats that simply outlasted weaker competitors again and again across thousands of years, until the ones who remained had learned to adapt faster than anything else in our solar system. We had become quiet, patient, and very, very good at recognizing real danger, long before it recognized us. Vera mocked me publicly twice more that first week. Once during a supply briefing where she asked, in front of 24 officers, whether humans required someone to chew their food for them, and once during a tour of the outer hull where she suggested, loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, that the only reason humanity had been allowed into the coalition was out of pity. I let both moments pass without a word, and each time, I noticed something she did not. The officers around her were not always laughing as hard as she expected. A few of them, the older ones, the ones who had served longer on dangerous frontier postings, watched me a little differently. They had seen quiet creatures before. They knew that quiet did not always mean weak. By the end of that first week, the station had settled into a routine, and I had settled into mine. I worked the lower decks during the day, observed everything I could, and reported back through secure channels to contacts within the human delegation off station, contacts who knew exactly what I was, and exactly why I had been sent here in the form of a trainee with no rank insignia. What none of us expected, not even me, was how soon that routine would shatter. It happened on the 8th day, during a routine patrol sweep along the edge of the contested system. A coalition scout ship failed to report in on schedule. Then a second ship, sent to investigate, went silent as well. By the time Vera called an emergency briefing on the command deck, the mood in the room had shifted from confident to something closer to fear, though most of the officers tried hard not to show it. The Drevuk had entered the system. I stood near the back of the briefing room, exactly where a trainee was expected to stand, and listened as senior officers debated what to do. Some wanted to pull every ship back to the station and wait it out, hoping the hunters would simply pass through and choose other prey elsewhere. Others argued that retreating would only invite the Drevuk closer, since predators of their kind were known to follow fear as easily as they followed scent. Vera, to her credit, did not panic. She gave orders with the kind of sharp confidence that came from a lifetime of being trained to lead, organizing patrol rotations, securing the outer docking rings, calling for volunteers to scout the edge of the system and gather more information before the Drevik came any closer. Nobody volunteered for that scouting assignment, not at first. The silence in the room stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, every officer suddenly finding something else to look at rather than meet Vera's eyes. That is when she turned, almost as an afterthought, and looked directly at me. "The trainee will go," she said, and a few quiet laughs rippled through the room again, though smaller this time, more uncertain. "He has little else to contribute here. Let him make himself useful for once." I felt the eyes of the room shift toward me, waiting for fear, waiting for protest, waiting for the soft human creature to finally show some sign of the weakness they had all assumed was there from the beginning. I simply nodded. "Understood," I said. "I will prepare immediately." Something flickered across Vera's face in that moment, something I would not fully understand until much later. It was not quite confusion, not quite surprise, but the faintest crack in the certainty she had carried about me since the very first day we met. She covered it quickly with another dismissive remark about hoping I knew which end of a scanner to point outward, and the room laughed again, and the briefing moved on. But I noticed the crack, and I knew, walking out of that room, toward the small scout vessel, waiting in the lower docking bay, that whatever happened next would not just decide my fate, or the fate of the crew assigned to fly with me. It would decide how this entire station, and eventually the rest of the galaxy, would come to understand exactly what kind of trainee humanity had sent them. I checked my equipment one final time, stepped into the narrow scout ship, and watched the docking clamps release behind me as the station fell away into the dark. Somewhere ahead of us, in the silence of the contested system, the Drevik were already moving, and for the first time since the laughter began, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, because I knew something none of them did yet. The hunters were about to meet something they had never hunted before. The scout ship was small, built for speed rather than comfort, with barely enough room for 4 crew members to move without bumping shoulders. I climbed into the narrow cabin and found my assigned seat near the rear, beside the sensor console, while the rest of the crew settled into their stations without much conversation. There were 3 of them. Mira, a sharp-eyed navigator from a species known for excellent long-range vision, sat at the front beside the pilot. The pilot himself, a quiet, broad-shouldered being named Corv, kept his eyes fixed on the controls, clearly uneasy about the mission ahead, but trying not to show it. Beside me sat Lena, a young communications officer who had transferred to the station only weeks earlier, and still had the nervous energy of someone who had not yet seen anything truly dangerous. None of them spoke to me directly as the ship powered up, and I did not try to start a conversation either. I had learned over the past week that silence often told me more than questions ever could. I watched the way Corv's hands moved slightly faster than necessary over the controls. I watched the way Mira kept glancing at the long-range scanner, even before we had left the docking bay. Fear, in every species I had encountered so far, looked remarkably similar once you learned to recognize it. The ship eased out of the station and turned toward the edge of the contested system, engines humming low as we accelerated into open space. Behind us, Station Vexar shrank into a small, bright point of light, and ahead of us, the darkness stretched out toward the region where 2 scout ships had already gone silent. Corv broke the silence first. "You have done scouting work before, human?" he asked, not quite looking back at me. "A little," I said, which was true in the broadest possible sense. Mira glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "The princess assigned you to this mission as a joke," she said, not unkindly, simply stating what everyone already knew. "You understand that, yes?" "I understand," I said. "It does not change what needs to be done." That answer seemed to surprise her slightly, though she said nothing more and turned back to her console. Lena, beside me, fidgeted with the edge of her uniform sleeve before finally speaking. "Is it true that humans cannot see very well in the dark?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of innocent curiosity that made the question feel less like an insult and more like genuine wonder. "Compared to some species, yes," I said. "But we have other ways of finding what we are looking for." She seemed to accept that answer easily enough, and the conversation faded as the ship pushed deeper into the system. I spent the next several hours doing exactly what a trainee should do, monitoring the sensor readouts, logging routine data, staying quiet unless spoken to. But underneath that quiet routine, I was doing something else entirely. I was reading the system the way I had been trained to read unfamiliar terrain back on Earth, long before any of us knew the galaxy was full of other thinking creatures. I noted the drift patterns of debris fields, the slow rotation of a nearby gas giant, the faint gravitational pull of an asteroid cluster that the other scout ships had passed through before losing contact. None of it seemed unusual on its own, but together, it formed a pattern, and patterns were something my mind had always been good at finding. The first scout ship had vanished near the edge of the asteroid cluster. The second had vanished almost exactly along the same drift line, only slightly further out. That was not a coincidence. Hunters who relied on patience and patterns of their own would naturally use a predictable hunting ground, a place where prey ships were forced to slow down or change course, where ambush became easier. I marked the coordinates quietly in my own log, without saying anything to the others. Not yet. I wanted to be certain before I spoke, because I understood something about this crew that none of them had said aloud. They expected me to be useless. If I spoke too early, with too much confidence, it would only confirm their assumption that I did not understand the danger we were in. I needed to wait for the right moment, the moment when speaking up would actually matter. That moment came nearly 3 hours into the mission, as Corv guided the ship along the very edge of the asteroid cluster, following the standard patrol route that the previous scout ships had used. I cleared my throat, keeping my voice calm and even. I would recommend altering our course, I said, away from the cluster's eastern edge. Corv glanced back at me, his expression somewhere between confusion and mild irritation. Why? He asked. That route is shorter. It saves us nearly 20 minutes of flight time. It is also the same drift line both missing ships followed, I said. I do not believe that is a coincidence. Mira turned fully around in her seat now, studying me with new interest. You have been tracking the previous ship's courses? She asked. I have been monitoring the data available to me, I said simply, which was technically true, even if it understated exactly how much attention I had paid to it. There was a long pause in the cabin, the kind of pause where everyone seemed to be deciding whether to take the suggestion seriously or dismiss it the way they had dismissed nearly everything else about me so far. Finally, Corv exhaled and adjusted the controls, steering the ship along a wider arc that avoided the eastern edge of the cluster entirely. It cannot hurt to be cautious, he muttered, though I caught the faint note of surprise in his voice, the realization that the suggestion had come from somewhere worth listening to after all. We continued on the new course in silence for a while, the tension in the cabin thickening with every passing minute. The asteroid field stretched out around us, jagged shapes catching faint starlight as we moved carefully between them. Lena kept glancing at the sensor readouts, her nervous energy growing harder to hide the deeper we traveled into the system. It was Mira who spotted it first, a faint irregularity on the long-range scanner, a shape too smooth and too symmetrical to be a natural formation. She called it out immediately, her voice tightening with alarm, and Corv slowed the ship at once, bringing us to a careful drift alongside a cluster of larger asteroids. I leaned forward, studying the readout on my own console. The shape Mira had detected was small, barely larger than an escape pod, tumbling slowly between two larger asteroids, as if it had been caught there by chance rather than design. It could be wreckage, Lena said quietly, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe her own words. Approach carefully, I said, before I could stop myself. Minimal engine output. If it is wreckage, there is no need to announce our presence to anything that might still be nearby. Corv hesitated only a moment before complying, easing the ship forward with the lightest possible touch on the controls. As we drew closer, the shape on the scanner resolved into something unmistakable, a section of hull plating from one of the missing scout ships, scorched along one edge but otherwise intact, drifting silently among the rocks. There was no sign of the rest of the vessel. Mira's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. That is the Halcyon, she said, the first ship that went missing. Lena's hands had gone still on her console, her earlier nervous energy replaced by something closer to dread. Where is the rest of it? She asked, though nobody answered, because nobody knew. I studied the wreckage carefully through the ship's external cameras, noting the pattern of damage along the scorched edge. It was not the kind of damage caused by weapons fire, not the jagged tearing or burn patterns I had read about in coalition reports on ship-to-ship combat. It looked almost surgical, a clean separation, as if something had simply removed this section of the hull rather than destroyed it. "They do not destroy their prey," I said quietly, remembering what Taurus had told me back on the station. "They take it apart." Corv turned to look at me fully now, his earlier irritation replaced by something closer to genuine concern. "You know about the Drevuk?" he asked. "A little," I said again, repeating my earlier answer, though this time nobody in the cabin seemed inclined to dismiss it as a simple trainee's modesty. We drifted in silence near the wreckage for several long minutes, scanning the surrounding asteroids for any further sign of the missing crew, finding nothing. Eventually, Mira suggested we mark the coordinates and report back to the station, and nobody argued with her. Whatever bravery any of us might have felt at the start of the mission had thinned considerably since finding that scorched piece of hull plating drifting silently among the rocks. But as Corv began plotting a return course, I felt something shift in the ship's sensor readings, a faint pulse on the long-range scanner that had not been there moments before. It was distant, barely registering against the background noise of the asteroid field, but it was there, and it was moving. "Something is approaching," I said, my voice low and even, despite the sudden tightening in my chest. The cabin went silent immediately, every console suddenly alive with frantic activity, as the crew scrambled to confirm what I had already seen. Mira's hands flew across her controls, her earlier composure cracking slightly as the readings sharpened into something unmistakable. "Multiple contacts," she said, her voice rising with each word. "Bearing 27 Mark IV, closing fast." Corv's hands tightened on the controls, his knuckles pale even against his dark skin. "Drevuk hunting formation," he said, the words coming out almost as a whisper, as if saying them too loudly might draw the predator's attention even faster. Lena had gone completely still beside me, her earlier nervous energy frozen into something closer to pure fear, her wide eyes fixed on the scanner readout showing 3 distinct shapes closing in from the darkness ahead. I felt my own pulse quicken, not with the kind of panic I sensed radiating from the rest of the crew, but with something colder and more focused, the same feeling I remembered from training exercises back on Earth, the moment when planning ended and instinct had to take over. "We need to retreat," Corv said, already pulling the ship into a tight turn, engines flaring as he tried to put distance between us and the approaching contacts. But even as he spoke, the shapes on the scanner adjusted their course to match ours, closing the distance with the kind of unhurried confidence that told me everything I needed to know about how this hunt usually ended. "They are not chasing us," I said quietly, watching the pattern of their approach with growing certainty. "They are hurting us." Mira looked back at me, her face pale beneath her usually composed expression. "Hurting us where?" she asked. I studied the scanner for a long moment, tracing the angle of their approach against the layout of the surrounding asteroid field, against the open corridor of clear space that lay just beyond the cluster's edge, a corridor that would lead any fleeing ship directly into open territory, with nowhere left to hide. "Toward open space?" I said, "where there is nothing left to use as cover." The cabin fell silent again, the weight of that realization settling over all of us at once. Corv's hands hovered over the controls, caught between the instinct to keep running and the growing understanding that running might be exactly what the hunters wanted us to do. "What do we do?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the question aimed at no one in particular, though every set of eyes in the cabin, even Corv's, even Mira's, turned slowly toward me. I looked at the scanner one more time, at the 3 shapes closing in through the darkness, patient and certain in a way that nothing I had encountered in this galaxy had been before. And for the first time since stepping off that transport ship 3 weeks earlier, I allowed myself to set aside the quiet, careful performance I had maintained since the very first day Vera had looked at me with such open contempt. "Hold this course," I said, my voice steady, carrying none of the fear that filled the rest of the cabin. "Do not run from them. Slow our approach instead, and let me see exactly what we are dealing with." Corv hesitated, clearly torn between his training, which screamed at him to flee, and the strange new certainty in my voice that suggested I understood something about this situation that none of them did yet. Trust me, I said, quieter now, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since boarding the ship. I have seen creatures like this before, in a different form, on a world far from here. I know how they think. Corv studied me for a long moment, then slowly eased back on the throttle, allowing the ship's speed to drop, allowing the three approaching shapes on the scanner to close the distance between us at their own unhurried pace. Mira's voice was barely steady when she spoke again. They are slowing their approach as well, she said, watching the readout with something between fear and disbelief. They are matching our pace exactly. I nodded slowly, watching the same pattern unfold on my own console, feeling the strange, cold clarity settle over me the way it always had during the most dangerous moments of my training, back when the stakes were just as real, even if the galaxy had been so much smaller then. Good, I said quietly, almost to myself. Let them come closer. Whatever was approaching through the darkness ahead of us was about to learn something that no creature in this part of the galaxy had ever discovered before, not in all the long history of the Drevik hunting whatever crossed their path without resistance. They were about to meet prey that did not behave the way prey was supposed to behave at all. The three shapes on the scanner grew sharper with every passing minute, until finally, through the forward viewport, we could see them with our own eyes. They emerged from the darkness like shadows given shape, sleek vessels built for speed and silence, their hulls a deep matte black that seemed to swallow the faint starlight around them, rather than reflect it. Lena let out a small, sharp breath beside me, her hand pressed flat against her console, as if bracing herself for impact. Corv kept the ship steady, though I could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful, controlled way he was breathing, to keep his hands from shaking on the controls. I leaned forward and studied the approaching vessels carefully, noting their formation, the way they spread out slightly as they closed the distance, forming a loose triangle around our position, rather than a direct line of approach. That is not an attack formation, I said quietly. That is an evaluation formation. Mira glanced back at me, her violet-tinged eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. What does that mean? She asked. It means they have not decided what we are yet, I said. They are studying us before they commit to anything. The three vessels slowed as they reached a certain distance, holding position just beyond what I guessed was effective weapons range, though I had no way of knowing for certain what their weapons range actually was. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened at all. No communication came through. No further movement, just three dark shapes hanging silently in space, watching us as carefully as we watched them. Should we hail them? Lena asked, her voice barely steady. No, I said immediately. Not yet. Let them make the first move. If we speak first, it shows we are anxious for their attention. That tells them something about us we do not want them to know. Corv glanced at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, something closer to genuine respect than the careful tolerance he had shown me since the start of the mission. How do you know any of this? He asked quietly. I did not answer him directly, because the truth was complicated, and this was not the moment to explain it. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on the three vessels ahead of us, watching for any sign of movement, any shift in their formation that might tell me what they intended to do next. Minutes passed in silence, the kind of silence that stretched every second into something far longer than it should have been. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, steady and slow, the same controlled rhythm I had trained myself to maintain during the most demanding exercises back on Earth, the kind of training that had been designed specifically for moments, exactly like this one, moments where the smallest mistake could mean the difference between walking away and disappearing entirely. Then, without warning, one of the three vessels broke formation and drifted slowly closer, close enough now that we could make out fine details along its hull, sharp angular plating that seemed designed less for armor and more for cutting silently through space without resistance. Mira's voice cracked slightly as she spoke. It is scanning us, she said, watching her console with growing alarm. Deep scan, full spectrum. They are reading everything. Our hull composition, our life signs, everything. Let them, I said calmly, though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to do something, anything, other than simply sit and wait. Stay still, stay calm, do not show fear in your posture or your breathing. They are reading more than just instruments right now. I am trying, Lena whispered, her hands gripping the edge of her console so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The scanning continued for what felt like an eternity, though my internal sense of time told me it had only been a handful of seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the scanning stopped, and the lead vessel drifted back slightly, rejoining the loose triangle formation with its companions. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a voice came through our comm system, low and resonant, carrying a strange, layered quality that suggested it had been translated through several different vocal apparatuses before reaching us in a language we could understand. "Identify yourselves," the voice said. "Species, vessel designation, and purpose for entering this hunting territory." Corv glanced at me, clearly unsure how to respond, his hand hovering uncertainly over the comm controls. I gave a small nod, and he opened the channel, his voice carrying only the faintest tremor as he spoke. "This is a Coalition scout vessel, registered to Station Vexor," he said. "We are investigating the disappearance of 2 previous scout ships in this region." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I began to wonder if the channel had simply closed without further response. Then the voice returned, colder this time, more deliberate. "Those vessels were claimed," the voice said. "This territory belongs to us during the hunting cycle. Your presence here is a violation." Lena's breath caught audibly beside me, and I saw Corv's hand tighten further on the controls, the muscles in his jaw clenching as he searched for some way to respond that would not provoke whatever was waiting silently outside our hull. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice low enough that only Corv could hear me clearly. "Let me speak," I said. He glanced back at me, hesitation flickering across his face, but something in my expression must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly and opened the channel for me, without argument. "I am Daniel Hart," I said, keeping my voice level and unhurried, deliberately stripping away any trace of fear or urgency. "I represent the human delegation aboard Station Vexar. We did not come here seeking to violate your territory. We came seeking answers about our missing crew members. That is all." Another pause followed, longer this time, and I could almost sense something shifting in the silence on the other end of the channel, a kind of recalibration, as if whatever was listening had not expected this particular response. "Human," the voice repeated slowly, testing the word, as if it were unfamiliar territory of its own. "We have heard of your species, recently arrived, largely unknown. Your biology registers as soft, vulnerable, easily claimed." I did not flinch at the words, did not allow even a flicker of reaction to cross my face, though I could feel Lena tensing beside me at the casual menace in that final sentence. "Many things have said similar things about my species throughout our history," I said calmly. Few of them remained around long enough to repeat the mistake. There was no immediate response to that, only silence stretching out across the channel, while the 3 dark vessels held their position outside our hull. I kept my breathing slow and even, kept my posture relaxed, despite every nerve in my body urging me toward tension, because I understood, with absolute certainty, that whatever was watching us through those scanners was reading my body language as closely as it had read our ship's hull composition only moments earlier. Finally, the voice returned, quieter now, carrying a note of something I could not quite identify, curiosity perhaps, or the early edges of uncertainty. "Your vessel registers low threat indicators," the voice said. "Weapons systems minimal, crew composition largely inexperienced. And yet your tone carries no fear consistent with those readings. Explain this discrepancy." I considered my answer carefully before speaking, aware that whatever I said next would shape everything that followed, not just for this single encounter, but potentially for how this entire species viewed my entire civilization going forward. "My species evolved on a world full of predators, far older and far more numerous than ourselves," I said slowly. "We were never the strongest creatures on our planet. We had no claws sharp enough to matter, no natural armor thick enough to stop a determined attacker, no speed that could outrun anything that truly wanted to catch us. And yet we are still here, while countless predators that once hunted us are not." "How?" the voice asked, and for the first time, the question carried something other than cold calculation, something closer to genuine interest. "Because fear alone does not keep a species alive," I said. "Adaptation does. We learned to recognize danger long before it reached us. We learned which fights were worth avoiding, and which could not be avoided at all. And when a fight could not be avoided, we learned to make absolutely certain it never happened the same way twice. The silence that followed stretched longer than any before it, and I watched through the viewport as the three dark vessels shifted slightly in formation, drawing closer together, as if conferring silently among themselves in a way our instruments could not detect. Corv leaned toward me, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing?" he asked, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "I am answering their question honestly," I said quietly. "That is the only thing that will work with a species like this. They can sense deception. They cannot afford to ignore the truth, even when the truth is unsettling." The voice returned again, and this time something in its tone had changed entirely, the cold authority replaced by something more careful, more measured. "Your readings remain unusual," the voice said. "Threat indicators inconsistent with biological data. Confidence inconsistent with vulnerability. This pattern does not match known prey behavior." I held my breath for a fraction of a second before responding. "Perhaps," I said carefully, "that is because we are not the prey you believe us to be." The three vessels held perfectly still for a long moment, and I could feel every set of eyes in our small cabin fixed on the viewport, watching for any sign of what might happen next. My own heart was pounding now, harder than I wanted to admit, though my voice and posture remained as steady as I could manage. Then, slowly, deliberately, the lead vessel began to withdraw. Lena gasped softly beside me, and Mira's hands flew to her console, double-checking the readings as if she could not quite trust what she was seeing. Corv simply stared, his mouth slightly open, as the other two vessels followed the lead ship's retreat, falling back into the darkness from which they had first emerged. "This hunting ground is contested," the voice said, distant now, fading slightly as the vessels increased their distance. "We do not engage on certain prey without further understanding. This encounter is concluded." And then, as quickly and silently as they had appeared, all three vessels vanished into the darkness, beyond our scanner's effective range, leaving nothing behind but empty space and the faint echo of a conversation none of us had expected to survive. For a long moment, nobody in the cabin spoke at all. Lena was breathing hard, her hands trembling slightly as she finally released her grip on the edge of her console. Mira sat frozen at her station, staring at the now empty scanner readout, as if expecting the contacts to reappear at any moment. Corv simply turned in his seat and looked at me, his expression somewhere between disbelief and something that I could only describe as awe. "They retreated," he said quietly, as if saying it aloud might somehow undo what had just happened. "The Drevuk retreated from us." I let out a slow breath of my own, allowing some of the tension I had been carefully concealing to finally drain from my shoulders. "They did not retreat from fear," I said quietly. "They retreated from uncertainty. That is far more dangerous to a predator like that than fear could ever be." Mira turned slowly in her seat, studying me with an expression that had shifted completely from the careful tolerance she had shown me at the start of the mission. "What are you exactly?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I considered the question for a long moment, watching the empty darkness outside the viewport, where three of the galaxy's most feared hunters had simply chosen to walk away, rather than risk an encounter they did not fully understand. "I am exactly what I told the princess I was," I said quietly. "A trainee, nothing more." But even as I said it, I knew none of them believed me anymore, not after what they had just witnessed, and somewhere deep inside, I understood that this single quiet conversation in the dark edge of a contested system was about to change everything, not just for me, but for how this entire region of the galaxy would come to understand humanity from this moment forward. We gathered the wreckage coordinates, marked the encounter in the ship's log exactly as it had happened, and turned back toward Station Vexor in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we had just witnessed and what it might mean once word of it finally reached the rest of the station. I had a feeling that Vera, in particular, was not going to take the news well at all. Word of what had happened reached Station Vexor long before our small scout ship even completed its docking sequence. I should have expected that, given how quickly rumors traveled through a station this size, but I had not anticipated quite how fast or how distorted the story would become in the few hours it took us to return. By the time we stepped off the ship and into the lower docking bay, a small crowd had already gathered, officers and crew members from half a dozen species, all of them watching us with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright suspicion. Taurus, the cargo handler who had first warned me about the Drevuk, pushed through the crowd and grabbed my arm before I had even taken 3 steps off the boarding ramp. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "Did you actually speak with them? Did they actually retreat?" I did not have time to answer before a sharp voice cut through the crowd, scattering the gathered onlookers as quickly as they had assembled. Vera strode through the docking bay with 2 of her personal guards trailing close behind her, her expression a tight mixture of disbelief and barely controlled anger. "Clear this area," she snapped, and the crowd dispersed immediately, though I noticed several of them lingering just out of earshot, clearly unwilling to miss whatever happened next. Vera stopped directly in front of me, her violet eyes narrowed, studying my face the way someone might study a puzzle that refused to make sense no matter how many times they examined it. "Explain," she said, her voice tight and controlled in a way that told me she was working very hard to keep her composure in front of the gathered crowd. I kept my own expression calm, matching her controlled tone with one of my own. "We located wreckage from the missing scout ship," I said. "We also encountered 3 Drevuk vessels along the eastern edge of the asteroid cluster." "And you survived this encounter," she said, the words carrying an edge of skepticism sharp enough to cut. "We did," I confirmed. There was a brief exchange of communication. The vessels withdrew shortly after. Vera's eyes narrowed further, and for a long moment, she simply studied me in silence, as if trying to find some flaw in my account, some detail that would allow her to dismiss the entire story as exaggeration or outright fabrication. "The Drevuk do not simply withdraw," she said finally, her voice low and dangerous. "They have never withdrawn from a confirmed encounter in the recorded history of this coalition, not once." "I am only reporting what happened," I said quietly. She turned sharply toward Corv, who straightened immediately under her scrutiny, his earlier confidence visibly faltering in the presence of her authority. "Confirm this account," she demanded. Corv hesitated only a moment before nodding firmly. "It is true, Your Highness," he said. "Every word. The humans spoke with them directly. They scanned our vessel, exchanged words, and then withdrew, without engaging." Vera's gaze swept across the rest of the crew, and one by one, Mira and Lena confirmed the same account, their voices steady, despite the obvious nervousness in their posture, as they spoke directly to the princess of a powerful founding species. For a long moment, Vera said nothing at all, simply standing in the center of the docking bay, her sharp eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made the surrounding crowd, which had crept closer despite her earlier order, fall completely silent. Then she turned and walked away without another word, her guards falling into step behind her, leaving me standing in the docking bay with my crewmates and a growing crowd of curious onlookers who had clearly heard every part of the exchange. That should have been the end of it, at least for the moment, but I knew, watching her stiff posture as she disappeared down the corridor, that this was far from over. I was correct. Less than an hour later, a formal summons arrived, requiring my immediate presence on the command deck. Unlike my first visit to that room 3 weeks earlier, this time the deck was crowded, filled with officers and dignitaries from every species represented on the station, all of them gathered to hear whatever was about to happen. I walked through the wide doors and found Vera standing at the center of the room, exactly where she had stood during our very first meeting, though her expression carried none of the casual amusement from that earlier encounter. This time her face was tight with something closer to controlled fury, mixed with an emotion I had not expected to see from her at all. Uncertainty. "You will explain yourself," she said, the moment I crossed the threshold, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "In front of everyone present, I want to understand exactly what happened out there, and I want to understand exactly what you are, because the story my officers have told me does not match anything I have ever heard about your species." I stopped a respectful distance from her and considered my next words carefully, aware that every alien officer in this room was watching closely, waiting to see how I would respond to a direct challenge from a member of one of the Coalition's founding royal houses. "I am exactly what my files state," I said. "A trainee from the human delegation. Do not insult me further," she snapped, her composure cracking slightly. "A trainee does not speak calmly to the Drevuk and walk away unharmed. A trainee does not recognize hunting patterns that experienced coalition officers failed to identify. Tell me the truth, or I will have you removed from this station entirely. I held her gaze steadily, weighing the consequences of revealing more than I had originally planned to share this early in our presence within the coalition. But looking around the room, at the dozens of faces watching me with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and growing respect, I understood that the moment for careful silence had already passed. Very well, I said. I will tell you the truth. The room went completely silent, every officer leaning forward slightly, eager to hear whatever I was about to say. My species has only recently joined this coalition, I began. Our first contact with the wider galaxy happened only months ago, which I understand has led many of you to assume we are a young, simple species, with little history of conflict or hardship. That assumption is incorrect. Vera's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, allowing me to continue. Humanity's homeworld is not a peaceful place, I said. We evolved surrounded by predators far larger and far more dangerous than ourselves, in an environment that offered no guarantee of safety at any point in our long history. We have no natural claws, no natural armor, no exceptional speed or strength compared to many of the creatures we shared our world with. And yet we are still here, while countless predators that once hunted our ancestors are now extinct, remembered only in old bones buried beneath layers of earth. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, though Vera remained silent, her expression unreadable as she listened. We survived through adaptation, I continued, through the ability to recognize danger before it recognized us. Through a willingness to study any threat carefully, to understand exactly how it hunted, exactly what it needed to succeed, and then to remove those advantages one piece at a time, until the threat itself ceased to exist. This pattern repeated itself across thousands of years of our history, against creatures more powerful than ourselves, in nearly every measurable way. I paused, letting that sink in before continuing. When my species developed organized societies, that same instinct carried forward into how we approached conflict between ourselves. Our history is not one of peace. It is one of constant adaptation, constant escalation, constant refinement of how we understand and respond to threats, whether those threats came from the natural world or from each other. By the time we developed the technology to leave our own world, that instinct had been refined over countless generations into something far more deliberate, far more controlled. Vera's voice, when she finally spoke again, had lost much of its earlier sharpness, replaced by something quieter, more careful. "And you believe this explains your encounter with the Drevik," she said. "I believe the Drevik recognized something in my behavior that did not match the threat profile of a harmless trainee," I said. "They recognized confidence without fear, calculation without panic, and an absence of the typical prey responses they have learned to expect from every other species they have encountered. That uncertainty was enough to make them withdraw, because predators like the Drevik do not risk engagement with prey they cannot fully understand." The room had gone completely silent now, every officer present absorbing the weight of what I had just explained, the implications settling over the gathered crowd like a heavy fog. It was an older officer near the back of the room, a grizzled veteran from a species I had not yet learned the name of, who finally spoke the question that seemed to be forming on every face present. "If a single trainee was enough to make the Drevik withdraw," he said slowly, "what exactly does the rest of your delegation consist of?" I considered my answer carefully before responding, aware that this question carried far more weight than the simple words used to ask it. "My assignment as a trainee was not entirely accidental," I said. "Humanity's military training programs are compressed compared to many coalition species, due to the urgency of our circumstances when we first encountered other intelligent life. What you consider a trainee, by your standards, would likely be considered something closer to a fully capable officer within many other delegations present in this coalition." Vera's expression had shifted entirely now, the earlier anger replaced by something closer to dawning realization, the kind of understanding that settled slowly and uncomfortably across someone's features as they began connecting pieces of information they had previously dismissed without a second thought. "You allowed us to underestimate you," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I did not correct your assumptions," I said carefully. "There is a difference." That distinction did not seem to offer her much comfort. She turned away from me slightly, her gaze sweeping across the gathered officers, many of whom were exchanging quiet, uneasy glances with one another. The earlier amusement that had filled this very room during my first visit, now entirely absent, replaced by something far more cautious. "Why would your delegation choose to present itself this way?" she asked, turning back to face me directly. "Why allow yourselves to be mocked, underestimated, treated as harmless, when the truth is so different?" I thought carefully about how to answer that question, aware that my response would shape how this entire room, and eventually the rest of the coalition, would come to understand humanity's place within this new galactic community. "Because announcing strength rarely earns trust," I said. "It earns fear, suspicion, and often preemptive conflict from species who feel threatened by an unknown variable suddenly claiming power within an established system. By allowing assumptions to form naturally, we gained the opportunity to observe, to understand the dynamics of this coalition, and to determine for ourselves who could be trusted before revealing anything that could not easily be taken back." The room remained silent for a long moment, the weight of that explanation settling over everyone present. Vera studied me with an expression I had not seen from her before, something far more complicated than the simple contempt she had shown during our earlier encounters, a mixture of caution, reassessment, and what I suspected might have been the early edges of genuine respect, however reluctant. "You embarrassed me," she said finally, her voice quieter now, lacking the sharp authority it had carried at the start of this confrontation, in front of my own court, repeatedly, while knowing exactly what you were. "I did not embarrass you," I said carefully. "Your own assumptions did that. I simply did not correct them." A few quiet murmurs rippled through the crowd at that response, and I saw the faintest flicker of something cross Vera's face, an emotion that looked remarkably close to grudging acknowledgement, though she was clearly unwilling to express it openly in front of her assembled court. She straightened her posture, regaining some of her earlier composure, though the sharp confidence that had defined her every interaction with me since my arrival was visibly more measured now, more careful. "This council is concluded," she announced, her voice carrying across the room with renewed authority, even as the dynamic between us had shifted in ways neither of us fully acknowledged aloud. "Return to your duties, all of you." The crowd began to disperse slowly, officers exchanging quiet conversations as they filed out of the command deck, their earlier dismissive attitude toward me replaced by something far more cautious, several of them glancing back in my direction with expressions I had not seen directed at me before. As the room emptied, Vera remained standing near the center of the deck, watching me with an unreadable expression. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us carrying far more weight than any of the words exchanged during the formal council that had just concluded. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now, almost private despite the lingering presence of a few officers still finishing their exit from the room. "I owe you no apology," she said, though her tone carried less certainty than the words themselves suggested. "I did not ask for one," I said simply. She studied me a moment longer, something shifting behind her sharp violet eyes, before she turned and walked away without another word, leaving me alone in the now mostly empty command deck, the weight of everything that had just happened settling slowly over me as I considered exactly how much this single conversation was about to change. I had no way of knowing, standing there in that quiet room, just how far word of this encounter would eventually travel, or how completely it would reshape the way an entire galaxy understood the quiet, unassuming species that had only recently joined their long-established coalition. But I was about to find out. News travels strangely across a coalition built from a dozen different species, each with their own communication networks, their own diplomatic channels, their own private gossip that moves faster than any official report ever could. Within 3 days of that council meeting on Station Vexor, I began receiving quiet, careful questions from officers and crew members I had never spoken with before, all of them curious about the human trainee who had somehow convinced the galaxy's most feared hunters to simply walk away. Within a week, the story had reached neighboring stations, carried by transport crews and passing officials, who repeated the account with the kind of exaggeration that naturally grows whenever a tale travels far enough from its original source. By the time I heard a second-hand version of my own encounter being retold by a maintenance worker in the lower decks, the 3 Drevuk vessels had become 5, and my calm conversation over a comm channel had become something closer to a face-to-face standoff that never actually happened. I did not bother correcting these exaggerations. The exact details mattered less than the underlying truth that had already taken root across this region of the galaxy. Something had happened that did not fit the pattern every coalition species had come to expect from encounters with the Drevuk, and that single fact alone was enough to shift how an entire community of allied worlds began reconsidering everything they thought they understood about humanity. I continued my duties as before, working quietly in the lower decks of Station Vexar, though the atmosphere around me had changed in ways both subtle and obvious. Crew members who had previously ignored me now greeted me with careful nods whenever we passed in the corridors. Officers who had once spoken over me during briefings now paused to ask my opinion before moving forward with decisions. Taurus, the cargo handler who had first warned me about the Drevuk, began seeking me out during breaks, asking quiet, thoughtful questions about Earth's history, about the conflicts and adaptations that had shaped my species into whatever the Drevuk had recognized during that brief, tense encounter. I answered his questions honestly, though carefully, sharing only as much as felt appropriate for a species still building trust within this larger community. I told him about the long history of competition and cooperation that had shaped human civilization, about the wars that had taught painful lessons about escalation and restraint, about the slow, difficult process of learning to recognize danger before it became unavoidable. He listened with the kind of genuine curiosity that made the conversations feel less like an interrogation and more like two people simply trying to understand each other across the strange new boundaries of a galaxy still learning how to coexist. The change in Vera's behavior toward me was slower, more guarded, though no less noticeable to anyone paying attention. She no longer summoned me to public briefings for the simple pleasure of mockery, as she had during my first days aboard the station. When our paths crossed in the corridors or during official functions, her sharp violet eyes would study me with something closer to careful assessment than the open contempt she had shown during our earlier encounters, though she remained too proud to openly acknowledge how completely her initial judgment of me had been proven wrong. It was nearly 3 weeks after the original encounter, during a routine coalition briefing about supply logistics, that I finally understood just how far the implications of that single conversation had traveled beyond our own station. A senior diplomat from a neighboring system, a tall, scaled official representing one of the coalition's oldest founding worlds, requested a private meeting with the human delegation, specifically asking for me by name. I met with him in a quiet conference room near the upper decks, where he wasted little time explaining the true purpose of his visit. "We have received reports," he said carefully, his translated voice carrying a formal precision that suggested he had rehearsed this conversation many times before arriving. "Reports of multiple Drevuk hunting parties altering their patrol routes to avoid systems with confirmed human presence. This pattern has been observed across at least 4 separate sectors within the past 2 weeks alone." I considered his words carefully before responding, aware of the significance of what he was describing. "Are you certain the pattern is connected to the encounter at this station?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "The timing aligns precisely," he said. "Prior to your encounter, human presence within the coalition was minimal and largely ignored by Drevuk hunting patterns, much like every other newly arrived species. Following the incident at Station Vexar, that pattern has shifted noticeably. The Drevuk appear to be reassessing the risk associated with engaging human-controlled territory." I sat with that information for a long moment, considering the broader implications of what a single quiet conversation had set into motion across an entire region of contested space. The Drevuk, a species that had operated with near total impunity throughout coalition history, were now adjusting their behavior based on uncertainty surrounding a single, relatively minor encounter with an unranked human trainee. "This will likely have consequences beyond simple hunting patterns," the diplomat continued, his tone carrying the careful weight of someone delivering information he considered both significant and slightly unsettling. "Other coalition species have taken note as well. Several delegations have already requested updated briefings on human capabilities and history, given how dramatically this incident has challenged previous assumptions." "I understand," I said simply, though privately, I understood far more than I allowed myself to express aloud in that quiet conference room. This was always the careful balance my species walked as we navigated our earliest days within this much larger, much older galactic community. We did not announce our capabilities loudly, did not seek to prove ourselves through displays of strength or aggression, because we understood, perhaps better than any other species in this coalition, exactly how dangerous it could be to appear as a threat before establishing genuine trust and understanding with those around us. But we also understood that some truths could not remain hidden indefinitely, that eventually, through quiet moments exactly like the one that had unfolded along that asteroid cluster, the rest of the galaxy would begin to understand exactly what kind of species had joined their coalition. In the weeks that followed, I watched that understanding spread slowly and carefully across the wider community, never through dramatic announcements or aggressive displays, but through quiet shifts in behavior, careful adjustments in how other species approached interactions with human delegations across the coalition's many stations and outposts. Diplomatic exchanges grew more respectful. Military briefings began including human representatives in discussions previously reserved for more established species. Even casual conversations among crew members carried a different tone, less dismissive curiosity, and more genuine interest in understanding a species that had proven far more complex than initial assumptions suggested. Through it all, I continued my work aboard Station Vexar, maintaining the same quiet, careful demeanor I had carried since my very first day, though the assumptions surrounding that demeanor had shifted entirely. I was no longer dismissed as harmless. I was, instead, approached with a kind of careful curiosity that I suspected would take considerable time to fully resolve into genuine trust, though I understood that trust, once earned properly, tended to last far longer than fear ever could. My final interaction with Vera during that particular assignment happened almost a month after the original encounter, during a quiet moment in one of the station's observation lounges, where I had gone to watch the slow drift of starlight through the wide viewport during a rare break between duties. She found me there alone, her usual entourage absent for once, and settled into the seat beside mine, without the sharp formality that had characterized nearly every previous interaction between us. "I have been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it, lacking the commanding edge that usually colored her every word, "about announcing strength rarely earning trust." I waited, saying nothing, allowing her the space to continue whatever thought had brought her to this quiet lounge. "My people have always valued strength openly," she continued. "We display it, we celebrate it, we use it to establish position within any hierarchy we encounter. Your species' approach is foreign to us, uncomfortable in many ways, and yet I find myself unable to argue against its effectiveness." I considered her words carefully before responding. "Different worlds shape different instincts," I said. "Neither approach is inherently superior. They simply reflect the different pressures that shaped each of our histories." She turned to look at me fully then, her violet eyes carrying an expression far removed from the contempt that had defined our first meeting weeks earlier. "I underestimated you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of an admission I suspected did not come easily to someone raised within her particular culture and position. "You underestimated an assumption," I said gently, "not necessarily me specifically. That distinction matters, I think, both for understanding what happened here and for avoiding the same mistake in the future." A faint, almost reluctant smile touched the corner of her mouth, the first genuine expression of warmth I had seen from her since my arrival on this station. "Perhaps," she said, "though I suspect my future caution around your species will extend well beyond simple trainees." "That would likely be wise," I agreed, allowing a small smile of my own. We sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, watching the slow drift of distant starlight through the wide viewport, the tension that had defined our every previous interaction, finally settling into something closer to mutual, if still developing, respect. I remained aboard Station Vexar for several more months after that quiet conversation, continuing my work, continuing to observe and report through careful channels, watching as the relationship between humanity and the wider coalition slowly shifted from cautious tolerance into something approaching genuine partnership. The Drevuk, for their part, never returned to that particular contested system, choosing instead to focus their hunting efforts in regions further removed from confirmed human presence, a quiet but unmistakable acknowledgement of the uncertainty that single encounter had introduced into their otherwise predictable patterns. I often thought back during those quiet months to that very first day aboard the station, to Vera's casual mockery during our initial meeting, to the laughter that had echoed across the command deck when she assigned the harmless human trainee to a mission everyone assumed would end in disaster. I understood, looking back, that her initial judgment had not been entirely unreasonable, given everything the Coalition understood about my species. At that early point in our relationship, we were new, unknown, and largely unproven within this much larger galactic community. But that was precisely the point my own species had understood from the very beginning of our journey into the wider galaxy. We did not need to announce our capabilities loudly, or demand respect through displays of strength. We simply needed to be patient, to observe carefully, and to allow the truth to reveal itself naturally, in its own time, through moments that mattered far more than any rehearsed declaration ever could. The galaxy had learned, through one quiet conversation along the edge of a contested system, that humanity was not the simple, harmless species many had assumed us to be. And though that lesson had begun with a single trainee facing down 3 of the galaxy's most feared hunters, I understood that it represented something far larger than my own individual actions that day. It represented the quiet, patient nature of an entire species that had learned, across countless generations of struggle and adaptation, that true strength rarely needed to announce itself. It simply needed, when the moment finally arrived, to be recognized. And from that day forward, across every corner of the Coalition that had once dismissed us so easily, the galaxy began to understand exactly what that recognition truly meant.